Businesses are boycotting Russia without influence by governments. In other words, there's a privatization of sanctions. I want to discuss this particular topic. I came across a podcast, a very interesting podcast, Capitalism, by Luigi Zingales, professor at the University of Chicago, and Bethany McLean, both very, very interesting people and talking about things typically finance and economics related. And this is a podcast, they spoke about the privatization of sanctions. And I thought it was an interesting topic, and it goes to something that I wanted to talk about also. So that's why I'm doing this episode now. And what I want to say is that it's time for businesses to stand up and oppose the Russian invasion, even if their own governments don't ask for it. The reason for that is twofold. One is we have a deterioration of government institutions, and second, businesses are being weakened by what Putin is doing. So in both cases, businesses need to step up, and they're doing it, and that's a good sign. And I think this whole thing, as bad as terrible as it is, the war and all these things in the Ukraine are bad. But the silver lining is that we have a strengthening of government institutions, a strengthening of the private sector, and that hopefully will get us to a situation like we were post-World War II, where we had purpose and hope in the United States and Western democracies. This is not in wrong podcast. It's March 17, 2022. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is up 3.2%. The market is up 1.2%. For the year, we are down 23.2%. The market is down 7.5%. We are underperforming by 15.5%. So let's talk about the privatization of sanctions. What does that mean? It means that private companies like Apple and L'Oreal and Renault and Raiffeisen in Austria, and you can, no matter who it is, at least openly, PR-wise, are opposing the Russian invasion in the Ukraine. Now, they might be still doing business under the cover and all that, but in general, we're seeing a privatization of sanctions, and I'm paraphrasing Zingales and McLean here. And I think that's a very interesting observation. And I think it plays sort of into the court of what I was talking about for a while, which is the deterioration of government institutions. What do I mean by that? I mean that in the Western democracies, particularly in the United States, let's focus on the United States. What I'm saying here applies to basically any other Western democracy, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and all that. But let's focus on the United States. We have been deteriorating our government institutions for decades now. And the reason for that is that we've been going away from having purpose for government along the lines of fighting for freedom, protecting freedom. And I think the main purpose of Western democracies' government has become a redistribution of wealth. You can see that in the conversations that are happening across the board in the parliaments, in Congress. You can also see that just looking at the government debt that is accumulated across the Western democracies, which is basically another way to say that in order to redistribute wealth, we've just used our institution of government to borrow money in the name of all the people and redistribute it to their constituency. So which on one hand is already a bad thing, but on the other hand, much more seriously, is also a sign of deterioration of government institutions. What I mean with that is that government has a purpose. Even in the most hardcore University of Chicago type view of the world, you still have a purpose of government. Government is there to serve the people, to create a place where people can freely move, exchange goods and services, educate themselves. There are certain services the government can do, one of them being, for example, protect your safety, because there's this thing called natural monopoly in economics, which basically means that certain things are better solved through a monopoly, and one of them is violence. It's better if we have one institution, a government that is democratically elected and has checks and balances and has the monopoly on violence, than if we have everybody basically going out there and having mob rule. Now, having said that, unfortunately, this particular function has deteriorated in the name of what I call redistribution of wealth. So if you look at the big speeches that are given in Congress on both sides of the aisle, or if you look at something like CNN and Fox News, the two extreme, the one hand the woke channel and the other hand the sort of, let's call it the right-wing channel, in both cases, the main conversation has always been about redistribution of wealth. Maybe not explicitly, but implicitly. In other words, let's say COVID was hijacked in the name of redistribution of wealth, and Black Lives Matter was hijacked in the name of redistribution of wealth, when in fact those were serious problems in both cases. Police brutality against people of color is a serious problem that needs to be solved, but it cannot be hijacked as a thing where you then just redistribute wealth by saying, well, we have to raise taxes, defund police, and give more money to poor people and things like that. So having said all of that, my point here is to discuss why is it that we have privatization of sanctions against Russia. And I think it's a clear sign of a deterioration of government institutions, because our governments are too weak. They don't have the spine, they don't have the mandate by their constituency to stand up against somebody like Putin. Now they're doing it, of course, verbally, to some extent also in military ways, but what businesses are doing is they're basically saying, look, we don't trust our governments, they don't have the spine to actually stand up against rogue states like Russia, so we're going to do it. And this is what's happening. And I think I disagree with Luigi Zingales here, because he makes the argument in his podcast that, oh, this is just PR, it's just sort of putting lipstick on stuff like that. I disagree. I think this is the first time since World War II that a rogue state is interfering in the world order directly in the Western world, in what we call sort of the Western democratic world, attacking a state like Ukraine. Clearly, we expect that not to be the last place he attacks. So he's following a blueprint that, let's say, Mussolini had, and Hitler, and all these other bad leaders and autocrats. So what we're doing here is basically trying to prevent that from happening by stepping up. And I think there has been a change in Zeitgeist since the Russian invasion in the Ukraine, where for some reason everybody in the Western world agrees with this particular situation, that Ukraine is they're the freedom fighters and the Russians are the bad guys. There's nobody, for some reason, it's almost unanimous here. I've never seen such a unanimous vote without being asked to vote. People are voting with their actions, with their words, with their feelings, and the businesses are voting too. And the businesses are voting because they are, on the one hand, of course, subject to mob rule. Luigi Zingales calls it the mob rule, and I think it's true. It is mob rule, but when do we have mob rule? When does mob rule happen? It's when we don't have government institutions. That's when the mob rules. Mob rule literally means the mob rules. Let's say in New York City in the early 20th century, the mafia ruled in Mulberry Street and in what we call Little Italy today, because the police was too corrupt and didn't fulfill their purpose of protecting people's safety. So the mafia took over, and similar things happened in Sicily, where the mafia actually originated. So in other words, we have mob rule now at the global stage, where governments are too weak. Let's say the German government is still buying gas from Russia. Although they had a complete turnaround in terms of their policy towards Russia. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, they were still debating if we should intervene at all and all that stuff. And Schroeder, he was on the board of Gazprom. Maybe he's not anymore. I don't care. But clearly, governments have been in bed with Putin and all that. So now that has changed. But still, businesses are a lot more extreme, just drawing a line. This is the red line. We're not doing business. We're forfeiting profits. And we don't want to do business with rogue states. I've called to action a few days ago, also in the context of, let's say, what Elon Musk is doing. I think Musk is, again, a forerunner here in terms of what businesses should be doing. He is explicitly challenging Putin in many ways. Of course, that's risky for us shareholders, because there could be retributions against him personally or against Tesla. But nevertheless, we think it is time to act now. The time has come where businesses such as Tesla and Apple and so on and so forth, Amazon, Google, they have to act. You can't just hide behind, oh, this is business. Or sport, in other words, sport the same way. The Premier League in England, the NFL, whoever is doing business with Russia now, they have to cut their ties. There is no broadcasting, no, Russian players are not allowed to be transferred, all that stuff. It's happening very extreme, and governments are taking actions. I'm not saying we have a strengthening of government institutions also. So it's not just that we have a privatization of sanctions because of the weakness of government institutions. We have a strengthening of government institutions. Look at what the UK is doing. Look at what the Premier League in the UK is doing. Abramovich cannot own Chelsea. Chelsea doesn't exist anymore as a football club. The only reason they're still able to play is because of some licenses that were given sort of technically the club doesn't have the right to exist anymore in this way or form, and I think it's a bit of a gray zone, and I'm personally actually not pro completely killing the club, because the players and the coaches and the quality of the play and all that is not directly related to the rogue regime in Russia. So I would try to find a solution where they can keep playing. My point here is being that we have a strengthening of government institutions. And I've said that several times. The silver lining of this terrible war in the Ukraine is that we actually have a strengthening of government institutions. We have a strengthening of the Zeitgeist, where people are sort of in a John Haidt type of way, using the righteous mind, the elephant, the rider of the elephant, basically making an emotional decision that what Russia is doing is bad, and then rationalizing it later. It doesn't matter, but it is bad. Why is it bad now? I don't even want to rationalize it. I think it's just bad, and we need to act, and we need to act very decisively. Now, why am I saying all of this on this podcast? Not even wrong podcast is a podcast that is the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense, well, it feels like they're on a hedge fund. So why am I talking about geopolitics here? Well, because we can't hide. We, as hedge fund managers, cannot hide either behind this. We have to take into account the fact that, for example, Tesla can be attacked by Russia either directly or indirectly. We also have to take into account that if China was going to invade Taiwan tomorrow, that Tesla should make a statement about that. I don't think it's the same gravity as what Russia is doing in the Ukraine, but it's not very dissimilar. And we have to even contemplate the possibility that Tesla closes down the factory in Shanghai and says, I'm not doing any more business in China. This is how far we need to go. It would cost us a lot. It will cost us probably at least 50% in the stock, if not more. I think as shareholders, we need to be aware of that risk. And we need to stand by Tesla as a company if they chose to withdraw from China, should China go that far. Now, I don't think they will. I think China has actually a lot more to lose by cutting their ties with companies like Tesla than they have to win by getting Taiwan. And this is a whole other podcast on its own. I'm just saying we have to be ready to act accordingly in that context. Lastly, I want to say one more thing. I think it's very logical for businesses also to act in this particular way, because again, from the Capitalism podcast by Gingalis and McLean, I've gotten this idea that we have this situation where basically after World War II, economics was superimposed onto politics. In other words, economics, businesses, wealth generation, all of that was more important than politics. We had that in the Western world, the Marshall Plan. We had that even when Deng Xiaoping took over China. Everything was about, look, we need to create strong economies and we need to subordinate politics to economics. The only state which wasn't doing that was Russia. And I've always said, as an investor for years, I've been looking at Russia and saying, this economy is not growing. There's nothing happening on the economy front in Russia. Russia is still a rogue state run by thugs, and there's nothing really changing. And this is now the proof. Russia, basically, with this invasion in Ukraine, is trying to reimpose politics on top of economics. In other words, businesses were running the show, and now with this invasion of Ukraine, all of a sudden national politics, armies, all of that stuff is becoming more important than businesses. I think businesses have a right to stand up and say, no, we don't want that. We want to stay on top of the world. And if governments cannot follow suit, then we could even have a situation like way back, let's say when we had the East India Company and companies like that, where businesses themselves have armies. We could have a world like that. I don't think we will, because again, like I said, we have a strengthening of government institutions. The Western democracies are actually a lot more efficient than they look right now. They could strengthen again by streamlining themselves and becoming more geared towards protecting freedom, protecting safety of exchanging goods, protecting safety of speech, and all these things. If we could get back to that, we don't need to go as far as having private armies. But if our government institutions actually keep weakening, we could have a situation where companies like Apple, Tesla, Google, because they have the wealth. Apple's market cap is double the GDP of Russia. So there is enough wealth there to create an army that protects Apple employees and maybe also Apple interests in the future. And that's exactly how it was, let's say, with the East India Company. They had their own army, the Hudson Bay Company in Canada, which was sort of sanctioned by the King of England. But they had their own army. Of course, the Brits helped, and they also got paid handsomely for that help. But the company was basically a government on its own, and we could have a world like that, where because of the weakening of government institutions around the world, we could actually have private companies taking over also the function of safety. Now, I don't think, I hope it doesn't happen. I don't, because I think companies are much better in providing goods and services and not very good at building armies. So the government should actually keep that monopoly. But again, if we have a continuous deterioration of government institutions, then maybe that would be a solution to this problem. Again, I think we have actually a strengthening of government institutions. I think the Zeitgeist is turning back again towards a strong government with a purpose of protecting people's welfare and safety, and trying to make exchanging of goods and ideas and services and all that stuff the primary purpose of people's existence, and not fighting for some rogue thug dictator. But again, we're at a crossroads right now, and I think this is a very, very strong sign that we're seeing the privatization of sanctions is a signal of also private companies to the governments, of our own governments, saying, listen, you got to take over this. We are sanctioning, but you got to take the lead now and create also a military situation, a geopolitical situation where rogue states like Russia cannot proliferate anymore, and where we as companies can go back to a situation where we do what we're very good at, which is create products and services and apply fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices to disrupt industries and create wealth. This is what businesses are best at. And because governments have been deteriorating over the last decades, they are now taking over also, let's say, this necessity of sanctions. I hope that we're seeing this change of zeitgeist back to like it was after World War II, where we have hope and we have purpose, both back installed into the Western democracies, particularly the United States. Thank you.